What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the Chargers franchise, and it is everybody's favorite time of the season, the offseason, as we finished in the AFC Championship game with a record of 11-5. Not the greatest in the scope of things. I think we were the second team, but the third place team was 10-6, and the first place team was 15-1. So we were a good, solid playoff team, but we weren't necessarily the surest lock of the group. That was definitely the Pittsburgh Steelers, and they showed why. Their backup quarterback and running back were able to defeat us by a score of 22-17 because of their defensive dominance over us. They dominated the game up front all day, even though I thought the offensive line was a strength of our team going into the playoffs and into that game more specifically. They killed us, and that's on us a little bit because of our poor performance, but I think that we overachieved slightly this year anyway. I expected to be maybe an 8-10 win team that made the playoffs and lost in the wild card or divisional round, but it was kind of just a perfect storm of an easy schedule on top of a bad division this year in this game anyway. The second place team was the Oakland Raiders, and they were 9-7 or 9-6-1, I think, 8-6-1 maybe, or 8-7-1, maybe something like that. I'll show the standings here in a moment, but right now on your screen you will be seeing the results of the Super Bowl as the Pittsburgh Steelers took on the Dallas Cowboys. It was actually the first Super Bowl in the history of the NFL to go into overtime. The Seattle Seahawks topped the banged-up Pittsburgh Steelers. They did not get their quarterback back, or their running back, I'm pretty sure, this game. But hard-fought game for them still, and it's scary to think how this team would have played the Seahawks if they had all of their starters in the game. But I'll talk a little bit more about how I expected the team to perform this season, the Chargers that is. And I thought that the offensive line was a strength coming into these playoffs, but it didn't really pan out that way. We pretty much got dominated up front defensively, and the Steelers have talent all over the roster, so it wasn't really a surprise. I thought their secondary was a bit weak, and that would probably be where we had to attack, maybe down the field passes, but down the field passes really can't develop when you're getting pressured almost every single play. It wasn't almost every single play, but it was quite a bit of the time, and that was kind of not really an area of concern I had going into this offseason, but there were a couple other things I noticed that could have really swung the game in our direction. But I'll get a little bit more into the things I thought we needed to address this offseason after we cover the retirements. No real big surprises here, maybe like James Casey and a couple of younger guys I was a little bit surprised by, but mostly veterans and guys who are aging. The two Chargers that retired, we got Carlos Dansby and Frank Gore. I expected both of them to retire. I actually expected Vincent Jackson to retire too, because I did a simulation of this earlier, and earlier in the season, just to test how this next off season would go, so I kind of had a plan, and Vincent Jackson retired in that simulation as well. But Philip Rivers did not, and he did not in this simulation either, so it's another redshirt year for Brent Vollers, but it's probably going to be the last year of Brent Vollers not being the starter, because I don't think Philip Rivers will stick around for another season, and if he does, I don't think he'll be a very productive player, so we'll probably be moving into the Brent Vollers era beginning next offseason. But this offseason, we have a prime chance to win a Super Bowl. And though I wanted to really try to build more through the draft with multiple years of good drafts and get back to a top spot in the AFC, that wasn't really the route that we ended up taking, because we had a couple of prime opportunities in free agency to get key contributors, and the first year we had so many good draft picks that we really made a significant one-year turnaround. I think part of that was the coaching change as well, but I do think a lot of that was the changes that we made in this past offseason. You don't make an 8-win improvement magically, but a key to making a long playoff run is depth. We re-signed a few guys to deals. We signed Ben Ijalana, our backup left tackle, to a 2-year, $2 million contract. None of it is guaranteed, so we can cut him at any time without having to pay him any money or take a cap penalty. We signed Tyler McKay to a 2-year, $3.06 million contract. He is probably going to be our depth, our backup guard going forward, because David Andrews expires after this season, and McKay has pretty much comparable stats at this point. We'll go over some of that a little bit later. Brandon Myers to another deal I think I talked about, or no, I didn't talk about. 1 year, $750,000 contract. He will be a good second or third tight end depending on what this offseason has in store for us. And we re-signed Roosevelt Eugene to a long-term deal of 3 years, a little bit less than $1 million each year. He is probably going to be serving as our primary kick and punt returner after his great performance in the AFC divisional round game last year. He also is a really good developmental wide receiver. He already has 87 catching and a few good ratings. He can be developed into a solid contributor down the road. But with retaining depth, there are also the opposite moves, and we had to cut a few players, both for cap space as well as roster space. King Dunlap, we moved back to left tackle before we released him to free agency, as that was his natural position, but he is a bit too expensive and declining in ratings. Eric Laird passed him. We also cut a few other key guys. We cut Daryl Worley, who was a big signing in last offseason, and we cut Brandon Flowers. He's the other really big move that we made in terms of releasing players. Other than that, we re-signed, or we cut a few guys. We cut Drew Kaiser, which I don't think is listed right here, but we cut Kenyon Drake, Jalen Marshall, Mike Sharp, Carl Nassib, Vincent Valentine, Seth Snell, Wesley Barton, Maurice Kennedy, Kevin Byard, VJ Cole, and Antoine Tolbert. I didn't want to cut Tolbert, but most of these guys were practice squad guys, and I felt that Tolbert is a player type that we could either re-sign later on, or we could sign to a better deal, because I think he was making like $2 million, because we signed him to a 2-year deal last offseason. I don't think any of it... No, we signed him to... I don't remember exactly, but most of these guys were practice squad guys. A few guys who were on our roster for depth before, like Kenyon Drake and Jalen Marshall, who I thought were very expendable and replaceable, especially since we had them making like $600,000. And between all this, minus the big moves of Brandon Flowers and King Dunlap, we saved, I think, about $4 million between the free agency stages before we got into that. But we did make quite a few moves after that, and we will get into each and every single one of those. And I decided to structure this a little bit different than the last offseason, where I just showed you guys the contracts. I'm going to show you guys the player skills too, but I will tell you what we signed all these guys to. So I wanted to move to a 4-3 system. I think I said that before. And so basically what ended up happening was we had to go sign a bunch of a few linebackers who could play zone and who could cover and who could also be pretty effective against the run, but mostly cover linebackers. We had a couple of good starting linebackers who are good against the run in Denzel Perryman and Dalton Dansby. So we signed JT Thomas, good zone coverage, good speed, decent instincts, and he's probably going to be like a second or third lineman or linebacker for us. He's not really going to be like a backup. He's just for depth as an option. We signed him to a two-year, $1.1 million per year deal. And I wasn't really concerned about our offensive line depth. We have a few solid players, but we didn't have really a backup center, because last year Eric Laird was our backup center and King Dunlap was our starting center, but now we only have one center on our roster, and I know it really probably doesn't matter, but we went out and acquired Evan Boehm on a 2-year deal, I believe, as a backup for, actually a 3-year deal for $3.8 million total. I don't know why. Oh, JT Thomas was a $1.1 million total deal. I have these written down as total contracts. We signed Evan Boehm for a 3-year, $3.8 million deal as a backup, and him and Eric Laird are going to be coming off the books at the same time. So maybe Boehm can progress into a solid guard by that point. He is still relatively young. He's only been in the league for a couple of seasons. I think he's like 25. Maybe he can develop into a solid starting guard that can replace Josh Sitton or Matt Slauson as they age, and even in like a stopgap sense. But he has very solid ratings so far, and except for his strength's a little low for a center, but we will definitely be working on those ratings with progression, so I'm not super concerned about that. So that's a solid center signing. Next up, we have a draft generated player from last draft that I somehow missed, or he was drafted or signed before I could get my hands on him in undrafted free agency. We have cornerback David Mooney, who will also probably be playing as a second or third string safety depending on the moves that are made later in this video. But he's a corner or defensive back with 85 zone coverage, 88 speed, and he actually has pretty good play recognition at 75 and decent tackling for a corner, as well as decent pursuit. His press is a little low, and his acceleration agility do need a little bit of work, as well as his awareness, but a 72 overall corner with 85 zone and 89 speed is always a solid guy to have, even if he ends up on our practice squad. We did sign him to a 2-year, $2 million deal, so about $1 million per year. So he will be a solid, fourth or fifth corner, maybe even deeper on the depth chart for us, as well as possibly a backup safety. And on the defensive back front, we also signed a man who was listed as a free safety, but if you look at his man coverage and press, 81 and 70, we really found a backup corner here, a 78 overall backup corner with good play recognition and pursuit, decent strength for a corner, good tackling for a corner, and obviously great coverage ratings for a depth corner as well. He also has an aggressive play ball tendency. So a 78 overall corner with good coverage ratings for, I believe we also signed him to a 2-year, $2 million deal overall. So he'll be moving to corner for us, but he is a solid sign, and I actually really liked this signing as a value signing because he's versatile and can cover both in man coverage and zone coverage at an above average rate. I would say 80, like high 70s, low 80s is above average, and this is already a better signing than Leon Hall was last season, even if this guy had to start on the outside. We still have Benford, obviously, but if we wanted to play more man, we totally have the option with this guy now. And I'm kind of going in order of impact for these free agents, but this was a really late free agency signing. We signed him in the last or second to last stage of free agency. Former Philadelphia Eagle Vinny Curry, who will be playing as a backup pass rusher in our system. Now, as you can see, I accidentally skipped scenes in my OBS recording. This is a guy who is perfect for exactly what we needed. We needed more help on the exterior pass rush on third down. And this is a guy who's going to be playing a lot for us in a nickel package as a pass rusher, because the way I'm planning this defense is we're probably going to be in base for first and short second downs, but when we know they're going to pass for like a second and long and a third down, any third down really that's like 3rd and 5 or more, we're going to be playing a lot of nickel with pass rushers on the field, and we can swing Joey Bosa inside because he's played defensive tackle before, like 3-4 defensive end and a 4-3 defensive tackle are basically the same thing. We can swing him inside and bring another pass rusher on the outside. The idea was to do that with Jarvis Jones. We never really got around to doing it with Jarvis Jones because he was limited, but Vinny Curry has both 80 power move and 87 finesse move, and this dude has been a pretty solid sack, like guy getting sacks and getting after the quarterback throughout his career. So I thought that was a really good signing late in free agency. He was a little pricey though, and he's going to impact our ability to get free agents after the draft, as he cost about $5 million. But he's only on a 1-year deal, so there is definitely something to look forward to about that, because if he underperforms for us, we can always get rid of him, or if we find a replacement in the draft, we can get rid of him as well. And with Frank Gore gone after being injured most of last season, I wanted to acquire another type of power back, and our old friend from the Washington Redskins franchise was available, Alfred Morris. 86 trucking, 87 ball carrier vision, 89 carrying. This is a guy that can come in short yardage situations, as well as situations where we want to spell Melvin Gordon, because he had a lot of carries last season, especially in the second half. This is a guy who can get you dependable yardage, pretty much a career 4-yard per carry guy, and a solid backup. He's been backing up Ezekiel Elliott for the last couple of years, who has turned into a monster in this franchise and in real life as well. He's not as versatile as Frank Gore. He's a little bit limited in terms of catching the ball out of the backfield as well as pass blocking, but we have other options at the position for that. Melvin Gordon is currently our only other running back on the roster, but he's a solid receiving back, and we can always address that position later on, as there are always options at receiving back and third down back types. Next up, we have a man with a deadly combination of skills. 87 speed and 73 zone coverage. Not the greatest zone coverage, obviously, but he has 87 speed at linebacker. Kevin Pierre-Louis, a former Boston College standout from a few years ago when I was still watching college football very heavily. He's the perfect linebacker for our new 4-3 system, as he is really fast, really good in zone, and he is a pretty decent run stopper as well. Now, obviously, he only has 82 pursuit, and his tackling is also 82. He has really not very good block shedding or hit power, but he does have pretty decent play rec and awareness, and as a stopgap player, he will be very effective. I should also mention we got Alfred Morris on a 1-year deal for about $950,000. Kevin Pierre-Louis was a little bit more pricey. He demanded a 2-year, $3.5 million contract, but getting a starting linebacker who fits your system almost perfectly with his deadly speed for $1.75 million a year is a very, very good value, and I'm happy that we found this guy in free agency, because I was not in love with the linebackers in this draft. And now we'll be getting into our big fish, as the next two and last two signings of free agency were big ones to address problems that I felt we had, and they didn't come very cheap, as we have a couple of Green Bay Packers, and I know we're really starting to build the Packers East with these couple of signings, because we already have, or Packers West, excuse me, because we already have Josh Sitton on the roster. This is a guy I've loved since his days at Fresno State. Him and Derek Carr were an awesome combo to watch that last year that they were both in college. I think they came out at the same time. Yeah, they must have. But Davante Adams has turned into a stud. He has superstar development. I did not capture that, but he has superstar development in this game. And he has really turned into a solid number 2 receiver, and that's exactly what I thought I was getting with Vincent Jackson last year. Unfortunately, when I played with him, he dropped many passes over the middle, and even though he had a really good catch and traffic rating, but Davante Adams is younger, he has superstar development, not the greatest catching, but he has a great catch and traffic rating, and he is a guy who's going to be dependable in that slot position. And we kind of already have a slot receiver. We have a couple of slot guys in Brink and Benjamin, but Davante Adams is the perfect guy for this role because he is great at making catches in traffic, and he is dependable hands. Now, obviously, not with the catching ratings, but he has 94 spectacular catch as well, so you can just throw it in his area, and he is going to go up and grab it. And that's a guy I really thought we lacked last season when Vincent Jackson as a signing didn't really work out. He did not come cheap, though. He demanded a 4-year, $29.8 million contract, but that's just over $7 million a year, and Keenan Allen is making about $7 million a year for the next couple years. And the way I think of it, $14 or $15 million for your best 2 wide receivers is actually kind of a bargain. You see guys like Calvin Johnson demanding, like, what was his contract, like $18 million? And obviously Keenan Allen's not as good, but Keenan Allen is a number 1 receiver. He's had, not the greatest season this last season, but 2 pretty elite years in a row in this franchise, dating back to 2015 when he did only play 8 games, but averaged about 88 yards per game. So I thought Davante Adams is a perfect fit for what we want to do. And the weakest spot on our roster by far in this franchise has been safety. We've never been able to really find anybody who can contribute at that spot. Obviously, Eric Weddle did leave the team the season before we started this franchise, and there was no replacing him. But we found a guy who's also pretty damn good. Clinton Dix. And yes, the team did finish number 1 in total passing yardage allowed last season, but I felt that was very fluky since our starting safeties were Terrence Mitchell and Brandon Flowers, who, despite having a pretty high number of interceptions for us last season, I don't really feel played the greatest. He wasn't a very good fit. He was declining. He only had about 75 zone coverage and 86 or 85 speed. And Clinton Dix isn't much faster, but look at his stats. 87 play rec, 83 awareness, 87 pursuit, 78 tackling, which isn't the greatest, but we can work on that. 83 hit power, but he also has 75 press and 83 jumping and 78 catching. So we can use him in a way that we couldn't really use either of those safeties last year because they weren't very good at forcing turnovers, I didn't think. And this is a guy who is going to be on the Chargers for a long time to come, as he did not come cheap and he did not come for a short time. I felt that signing him to a long-term deal was very beneficial for our team, as he was already the 5th best free safety in the league, and he still has years to develop, as he's only 25 years old, I believe. We signed him for a 7-year, $64 million deal. Now, you might be thinking that's a little expensive. He doesn't have the greatest skills for the kinds of safeties that I like to have in franchise, but overall, when you take all of this into consideration, he's only 25 years old, and this is really like the last time before everybody gets paid or everybody is going to get paid that we can make big free agent moves. Melvin Gordon and Denzel Perryman are both up for extensions this year, and then after that we have to sign pretty much we have to sign Joey Bosa the year after that, and then the year after that we have to sign pretty much all of our rookies from year 1, because guys like Parker Donahue, Deshaun Snell, we would really like to keep. We have guys like Eric Lair at center who are on cheap deals right now. I've talked about this before, how one of the best ways to win a Super Bowl is by having cheap talent. I actually think I said this last offseason, having cheap talent, controllable talent on rookie deals, as well as having a solid balance of veterans. And we addressed 2 of our biggest needs in free agency instead of the draft, but our draft class this season was not very strong, as you're about to see. Now, part of the reason our draft class wasn't so strong is because we made a trade to move ahead of the Washington Redskins by trading with the New England Patriots for the 22nd overall pick, because the prospect I wanted was coming up, and there was a giant hole at this position on Washington's roster, so I didn't want them jumping us. But this is part of the reason that our team isn't as good. I think that's our own 3rd round pick that we traded, I believe. And we traded a 7th round. We had 2 7th rounders this year. So that's part of the reason that it's not going to seem like our draft was as good, but this draft class overall was incredibly weak. There weren't very many first-round prospects that I like, and this is the only guy I would have even considered taking in the first round. I probably would have traded out of the first round entirely if we weren't able to get this guy. Dondre McKee, safety, Louisville, 90 speed, 82 zone coverage, 76 tackling, 80 pursuit, 64 play rec, which isn't the greatest, but he has 89 hit power, 91 acceleration, and he was the 10th best player in the draft, and we drafted him 22nd overall. Not to mention, he has superstar development for a safety who's already pretty good, who could use a little bit of work, but he's definitely going to be a starter for us from day one. It's going to probably come down to him and Terrence Mitchell for that other safety spot, because Terrence Mitchell, not as good zone coverage, but he's a little bit more developed in terms of the play rec and awareness and tackling. But this is definitely a guy who's going to be a cornerstone for our team for a while as a safety. He is a very, very good pick for number 22, and I'd say he was definitely well worth trading up for. Now, if you remember back to last offseason, the best value pick I felt that we got in the last draft, Eric Blair might take that position now, but I feel that the best draft value we got last offseason was Dominique Bernard in the 4th round with, I believe, the 11th pick in the 4th round. A very good developer, a very quick developer out of Florida State who needed a little bit of work on some intangibles like play rec and awareness, but was already a pretty good defensive tackle / interior defender from day one. And I feel that we got another one of those, Russell Newkirk, who is a little bit slower of a developer, but he's the 12th best player in the draft. He's just as good as Dondre McKee. If you remember, he was the 10th best player in the draft, and we drafted this guy with the 63rd pick in the draft. Now, there is a couple caveats to this. One, he's not the greatest against the run, and he has slow development. He does need work on some intangible ratings, but this is a guy who, like I thought about Dominique Bernard last year, could replace Corey Liuget. Now, we're going to keep Corey Liuget, and he is going to be the starter for the next season because his ratings currently are better. But he's aging. I know his ratings are going to get worse, and he's also getting very expensive. He's going to be paid, I think, $10 million next season, and that's not a contract that I want on my books. So we are going to be holding on to this guy and hoping he can develop into a guy that we can hold on to for a few years and be an excellent defensive tackle. Here's 87 power moves as well as an 85, I believe, block shedding. It's not on my preview screen right now because I had to loop it around and I haven't done that yet. But very good pick for the 2nd round, just as good as our 1st round pick, arguably. He didn't fill a position in need like our 1st round pick did, but he is just as talented. He's actually going to go up in overall when I move his position to defensive tackle, too. Because right now he's listed as defensive end, even though he's a 4-3 run stopper, which I didn't even know was a player type in this game. But he's going to become a very high overall when I do change his position and player type a little bit later in the video. We didn't have a 3rd round pick. We had a high 4th round pick that we got from Cleveland, I believe, last offseason, or somebody last offseason. We're going to trade this pick. Wasn't high on anybody at this position, and Chicago's offering us a 4th or a 5th rounder next year, which I can only use for trades or just depth pick in a better draft. And using that 4th round pick we got from moving down with Chicago, we drafted a corner not unlike David Mooney earlier in this offseason, Louis Brinkley. Now, he's got, I think, better zone and better press, but he does need work. He also has really high play rec for a rookie. He needs work on his man. It's only 73. Right now, he's not a very good man-to-man color corner, but he already has 76 press, and I feel that with a couple of years on the bench to learn behind some of the better corners on our roster, he can definitely turn into something very, very valuable for us. And I'm very happy with this pick at this point because we do need depth at corner, even though we already signed a couple of guys who can be depth corners. We didn't have any behind the 3 corners of Casey Hayward, Jason Verrett, and Antoine Benford, who is only a 2nd-year player. He's no sure thing yet. And actually, guys like David Mooney and Louis Brinkley are better in zone anyway, so they're probably not cut out to be players for us right away. So really, we only have 4 corners on the roster, and we also, as of right now, only have 3 safeties. And now for what will be our final pick, as we will end up trading away our 7th rounder. I will show you a bit later after this is over. But a guy who is a plug-and-play pass rusher, not unlike the man we signed earlier this offseason, Vinny Curry. Amon Middleton, quick development, and he is, I believe, that says 18th best player in the draft, and we drafted him at the end of the 5th round, or 48th, excuse me. So we got 3 of the top 50 guys in the entire draft in our 3 picks, and one of them was a 5th rounder, one was a 2nd rounder, and one was a late 1st. So we got great value at all of our picks this draft. And this is a guy who really could be a replacement for Melvin Ingram, who is aging, and his skills haven't really translated to play on the field. He hasn't had a double-digit sack year either of these seasons, which I don't expect everybody to have double-digit sack years all the time. I think Joey Bosa just had his first this past season, but he's definitely a guy who needs to be replaced at some point. And this guy's young. He is 23 years old, which isn't not the youngest, admittedly, but he has a couple years to learn on the bench. If he's starting by 25, and we get him on a 2-year deal as a 5th-round pick, or basically on a 2 years left on his deal as a 5th-round pick, a guy who's a great pass rusher. He does only have one move right now, but he has quick development, and the way I have it set up right now is I'm developing defensive linemen and safety or defensive backs. So because we don't really have any great young linebackers outside of Dalton Dansby and Denzel Perriman, who are both already pretty high overalls, this guy is going to be like a low 80s guy very soon, and he is a guy who, like I said earlier with Vinny Curry, we found a replacement for Vinny Curry down the road in the draft. So this is a guy who is going to be very, 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 very serviceable for us. Here we're trading away our 7th-round pick, and the only trade offers for this were 4th-round picks. We had 4 4th-round pick offers, one from Denver, one from Oakland, one from New England, and one from Atlanta. We're going to take the one from Atlanta, not only because they were the highest pick, which it didn't weigh on my decision at all, but it's an AFC team, or an NFC team, and I didn't feel right trading a 7th-rounder for a 4th-rounder with an AFC team, but I didn't want the pick, really, because the only guy I was looking at this point was a punter, because we got rid of Drew Kaiser, or we were going to get rid of Drew Kaiser. I don't know if I did already at this point or not, but the only guy I was looking at was a punter, and I didn't want to waste a draft pick on him because I knew I could get him in like post-draft free agency. So what we ended up doing was trading this for our 4th-round pick with the Atlanta Falcons, and so that's going to finish off our draft class. A small one, but very, very strong, as we got 2 78s, a 76, and a 72. Now that 72 looks bad in comparison, but he's really a developmental guy. He already has really good skills. I like him, and he is going to be getting quite a bit of attention in our development, but I'm really happy with this draft class. Now, we didn't have the roster space for a whole lot of rookies anyway, but all 4 of these guys are going to be great guys for the roster. Louis Brinkley is a guy that was on the bubble. I didn't know if I'd want him on the roster, but we didn't end up signing any extra defensive backs, so I thought that having a couple extra corners who could potentially play at safety if there were any injuries was a good skill to have. We were going to make a couple more, or good asset to have. We were going to make a couple more moves, though. These are a few guys we signed in the post-draft free agency period, so they're a little bit more expensive. I believe we ended up cutting Clint McDonald and Gerald Hodges from the roster, but the other 3 guys are going to stick. Now, you might be thinking, why are you going to have a 4th quarterback on the roster? Well, that's because we're about to make a couple more trades. And Jimmy Garoppolo was part of this trade. He was one of the only guys I felt we didn't really need to hang on to. We also gave up a 3rd-round pick. And in exchange, we got Jonathan Joseph. I was not super confident in our corners this offseason, and we got 2 more safeties. But I didn't feel that Antoine Benford was a 3rd corner on a Super Bowl team. And Jonathan Joseph does have a higher overall than Casey Hayward, but he is going to end up being our 3rd corner in nickel sets. We're going to slide Casey Hayward inside and put Joseph out on the outside. He's not as good in press as you can see on your screen right now in his ratings, and he's a little bit slower than prime Jonathan Joseph probably was, but his coverage ratings, his man and zone, are the exact same as Jason Verrett's, and when you can get 92 man and 89 zone on the outside in a veteran such as Jonathan Joseph, who's still ranked as the 12th best cornerback in the league for a 3rd-round pick, I feel that it's really a move that has to be made. And this is a team in the Texans that was a competitive team last year, but Jonathan Joseph was on the trade block, and they have a lot of really good options at corner going forward, including their 1st-round pick, Kevin Johnson, from this past offseason. And then they have another really good young corner, well, younger than Jonathan Joseph, corner as well, that I can never remember the name of, but they still have all these guys on their roster. Jonathan Joseph is expendable, and we are going to swoop in and grab him for quite the value. But there's a reason I'm showing secondary stats for him, secondary attributes, that I didn't show for many other signings or any other signings at all. He has 82 injury and 68 toughness. So, you know, part of the reason that I didn't want to really give up any better assets, like a 3rd-round pick is still a great asset because usually that's a guy who turns into a good starter at very least for you. His injury rating is only 82 and his toughness is only 68. So this guy's very, very risky trade, actually. And I do feel solid about our depth below him if he does get injured, but I still felt that this was a deal we had to make to really in that upper echelon of teams, because even though we made it to the AFC title game last year, I didn't feel that we were title contenders. I was surprised that the Pittsburgh game was as close as it was, and if Ben Roethlisberger and Ben Roethlisberger and Le'Veon Bell had been in the game along with Antonio Brown, our secondary would have gotten eaten alive, because we didn't have Jason Verrett, and Casey Hayward and Antoine Benford were okay corners, but we had Leon Hall at that other spot. So I felt that acquiring a good corner, even if he's a little slow, is going to help us out quite a bit for our playoff hopes this season. So this trade is going to be going through, and we are going to be right up against the cap with this trade. Part of the reason that Jimmy Garoppolo was a part of the trade is because he had a high cap hit, as I said before, and he was one of the only guys that we could put in this trade that wasn't a key contributor for us, that would put us within cap compliance to make this deal with acquiring Jonathan Joseph, who I should also mention is in the last year of his contract. So if he performs well for us, we can sign him again at a potentially cheaper price. And with the signings of Spencer Ware and Alfred Morris, I still felt that though we had a couple of good power back options, we didn't have a good third down type of back. And CJ Prosise is that guy for us. There were a few different options on the trading block, and Jamal Charles was available in free agency, and I really considered making a run at him, maybe clearing up a little bit more cap space by making a couple of different roster moves, but ultimately we decided to trade for CJ Prosise. The big reason I traded for CJ Prosise over some of the guys on the trade block is because he has 2 years left on his deal. He's not just an expiring guy. He's a guy who we have under contract for an additional season as a third down back, so we can have time to maybe find an option in the draft or a option in free agency, or even re-sign CJ Prosise to a like $2 or $3 million deal. He has very solid ratings: 90 speed, 90 acceleration, 87 carrying, as well as 74 catching. His awareness is a little bit low, and he's not a super elusive back, but he's definitely a guy who can make plays out of the backfield on third down, get us some short yardage, and he is a very dependable back, in case of an injury or in case we want to maybe reduce Melvin Gordon's workload down the stretch. This is definitely a guy who can be a very good back for us coming into this season. And this offseason went a lot slower than I expected. This video is going to be over 30 minutes long, so I'm going to leave you guys with a look at our schedule. I will be making a separate video that is going to be breaking down the depth chart position by position for this upcoming season and discussing what I expect out of all of these different players and why I put them in the specific roles I put them in. I'm also going to be covering a couple of different formation changes that I made and showing off kind of what offense we're going to be running this next season. So we do have a very easy schedule in the first half again this season. And while I won't be playing all 16 games, I will be playing more than half of the games this season. I believe I've only played 8 each of the last 2 years. I actually think I only played 7 in the first year, but I will be playing probably 10 to 11 games in this season. We have a very kind of easy first half schedule. We play a lot of teams that picked very high in the draft this last offseason, of course. We do have some very good matchups in the first little bit of the season. I'll likely be playing week 1 against the Raiders in any primetime game that is on our schedule. Most of them are in the second half. I think we have 3 primetime games in the second half, maybe just 2. But we'll be playing the Oakland Raiders on Monday night for the second straight year in a row. This time it's in LA, not on the road. Then the schedule gets a little bit easier. We're going to be playing the 49ers and the Rams, who picked in the top 10 of the draft each of the past 2 seasons. We have a rematch against the Houston Texans from the playoffs, and then we have 2 pretty easy games. I'm not going to call any of these easy games because any team can win on any given Sunday, but the Chiefs are a really weak team despite winning the Super Bowl 2 years ago, and the Cardinals were the #1 pick in the draft this past offseason. I might play against them because they have a new quarterback too. So that'll be interesting to check out. We might be seeing them, but we will be playing the Jets in Week 8. They were another fellow playoff team, and I had the opportunity to play against them last season, and I didn't think their team was going to be very good, but this season we have the opportunity to play against them, and I'm not going to pass it up this time. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next time for a depth chart overview, followed by the opening game of the season against the Oakland Raiders. Thanks, everybody, for watching. See you next time.